Hello and welcome to Public Affairs Today. I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo. Public affairs is a dynamic, multifaceted field that touches your life in ways you may not realize. Today, we're talking about the country's fastest growing population, and that is our Latino population. With me today is Professor Estelli Ramos. Welcome and thank you for joining me. And this is an area in which you exclusively work. You work with the Latino population, and specifically you look at the Latino youth and their risk for gang activity. And one of your reasons for coming to Central Florida is because we have such a significant Latino population here. So let's start talking about the Central Florida scene. What are your observations so far?
I think Central Florida is creating a Latino expression that is unique in that they have different Latinos that are coming here to Central Florida. Here in Orlando, we've seen a huge increase in the Puerto Rican population, mainly migrating from the island and also from New York City and Chicago. And we're also seeing an increase of Central Americans, South Americans, and Mexicanos. So it's really creating a sense of what Latino consciousness is all about and what Latino culture is all about. So we're seeing a city that is creating a mixture of all diverse Latinos that make up the population in this country.
Now, in talking about those populations, and I grew up here, with the Mexicanos and the Puerto Ricans, in my experience growing up, there was a difference where the Mexicanos tended to be migrant workers, so they would come and they would leave. Whereas when Puerto Ricans began coming to Central Florida, they came here to have a home. We're now seeing a change. The Mexicanos they're getting rooted, they're staying here. What does that mean for our area? And you know, that we don't have the migrant population that so many other cities have had to deal with, and in some circumstances it's created a negative image for Latinos.
Well, I think it's since Central Florida does have that migrant population, we're just not seeing it here in Orlando. We're seeing it in the outlying areas. Mm-hmm. North of Apopka, we're starting to see an undocumented community that's growing. Maybe south of Kissimmee, we're starting to see this growth also. So I think it's a matter of time before we start to see the undocumented community that's migrating back and forth, establishing itself more and more in Orlando. I think that it's about how the Latino population is changing here in Orlando. I think when you start to look at the differences between the Puerto Rican community and the Mexican community, you have many Mexicanos that also are legal and are documented and are part of the political process here in this country. And then you have a lot of undocumented Mexicanos that are not in legal status here. And those are the ones that you see more transient going from place to place. So I think it depends on what type of Mexicano you're seeing settle here in Orlando. Whereas with the Puerto Rican community, because of their political status and their legal status being born U.S. citizens, we don't see that migratory pattern taking place as much. Although Puerto Ricans tend to research shows us that Puerto Ricans tend to move back and forth a lot. There's always this concept of, I want to go back home to the island, mm-hmm. and I want to go back to the United States. And so we see that trend going back and forth a lot. We're starting to see it here in Orlando. There was a huge rise in the number of Puerto Ricans over the last 10, 15 years. We've seen in Osceola County a slight dip in the numbers. Some people are beginning to estimate that Puerto Ricans are starting to leave Osceola and moving more into some of the southern states. We're seeing that increase of Puerto Ricans in the Georgia area. So Puerto Ricans are also a very migratory population. It kind of depends on what's going on.
Well, what's behind that? Is this because of economic opportunity? Is it because they get here and they just decide they don't like Central Florida? We know that going back to the island is a matter of being homesick. Mm-hmm. So why are we seeing that much fluidness in the Puerto Rican population?
I think for various reasons. What's interesting is that the Puerto Rican population in Central Florida is a mixture of a lot of island Puerto Ricans and also a lot of New Yorkers and Puerto Ricans from various metropolitan areas in Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. So they are those Puerto Ricans who are born and raised in the United States that are moving to Orlando. And then they are those Puerto Ricans who are coming from the island. So I think that many of them will have different reasons. I think when you move from a city like New York, and you move to Orlando and you start dealing with some of the issues of changing from a large urban center to a smaller metropolitan area like Orlando, I think that adjustment process is difficult. So we're starting to see that maybe some of the reasons why Puerto Ricans are having a hard time settling here is that support systems are a little different here. And also adjustment process is a little different with the education system, the jobs, the job market. You're in New York, you have a larger industry, salaries are different than when you move here. So that may be some of the causes that are contributing to the fact that Puerto Ricans are moving back and forth more.
Well, the adjustment process is not only difficult for the adults in the family, but apparently it's difficult for the kids in the family. There was that recent CDC study that came out that said that Latino youth are at risk, and that particularly Latino girls, teenage girls, seem to be having the most difficulty in not only adjusting to new cultures, they're having the pressures of their parents' traditional culture with being here in the United States and, trying to adjust to the culture here and finding a balance. What's your take on that study?
The CDC's new study also indicated that there needs to be more research to help look at this issue, because they really were not able to identify what are the contributing causes to this huge effect in the Latino population here in this country. Myself, being a Puerto Rican born and raised in the United States, I can identify with some of the issues that Latino youth go through because of the fact of being bicultural and being bilingual in a country that is monolingual and monocultural can really create some identity-based issues. And so maybe some of the contributing factors can be related to this dual identity that Latinos are facing here in this country. I think when we start to look at issues like suicide or mental health status among Latinos, it becomes important to be able to differentiate between a Latino born and raised in the United States and a Latino who comes from his or her motherland, such as Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, or Mexico. I can definitely look at those Latinos that are born and raised in the United States. You're raised with this sense of pride for your homeland, and although this is really your homeland because you're born here, your cultural connections teaches you to love Puerto Rico and to have a strong identity. So there's always this identity search that Puerto Rican youth born and raised here in this country go through. When you look at the Puerto Rican youth that are born in New York City or in Chicago, for example, they are the first ones to put the Puerto Rican flag on their T-shirts and in their gym shoes and the bandanas in their head, and really show this sense of pride and this orgullo for being Boricua. And so there's this search that we're always going through. So I think identity plays a key role in it. But there's also a lot of issues related to education, socioeconomic status, support systems, that I think Latinos tend to lack those support systems in many urban areas. So that may be one of the contributing factors that we may be seeing taking place in our youth. But I think it's also related to the fact that, if you look at our Latino population, we survive on our own. I mean, it's not like the Irish or the Germans who came here in the 1800s who found a process of assimilation. If you look at our own culture today, you see that Latinos, we have our own television programs, we have our own media, we have our own communities, our own magazines, our own stores, we have our own Grammy Awards, we have our own music. So we survive in our own world. And sometimes I can't help but observe how some of the macro systems that create support in areas of mental health or in different areas are just not as well connected with the Latino community. And I think those are some of the outcomes that we may be seeing.
Okay, so is that why things were different for me? Because my mother is Puerto Rican and I was born here, but I grew up in Central Florida. I didn't live in a Puerto Rican neighborhood. They didn't exist when we moved here. So growing up, I never felt any of those cultural conflicts. I mean, is that the difference? Because I didn't grow up in a predominantly Latino neighborhood?
Well, not necessarily, because there will be many Latinos who grow up in a predominantly white neighborhood and may have those identity issues also. I think it's related more to the fact that there's a difference between a Puerto Rican who's just arrived here or a Puerto Rican who is born in a family of socioeconomic status. I think that with lower socioeconomic status, I think that's important to look at. Because maybe your socioeconomic status provided supports for you that maybe being poor and living in Brooklyn may not provide for you. So that a lot of it is also related to the support systems that are around you. You mentioned that you lived at a time in Orlando where there were no Puerto Ricans around. I can imagine that was a long time ago, because today there's not an area in Orlando where you cannot go to and not find a Puerto Rican.
That's true now. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. It's mind-boggling to me now to see where we live from where I came from, because when I was a kid, this was still Cowtown.
Yeah. Yeah. And things have changed drastically here, but now we see a larger population. What's interesting about the Puerto Ricans in Central Florida, at least some of my observations, is that it's a growing community. It's a working middle class community. Some research shows that Puerto Ricans in Central Florida have the highest home ownership from other Puerto Ricans in the country, tend to have more intact family systems. So this is an interesting population to look at and to research to see what future generations are going to create here.
The CDC study, when it talked about some of the risk factors that Latino teens are facing, had me wondering whether that put them at higher risk for joining gangs or getting involved in gang activity. And that's an area in which you've done a lot of work. Does it?
Yes and no. I think that they are, like as we mentioned earlier, a lot of factors going on in environments that may create or be able to force a young man or a young lady to join a street gang. I don't think there's something inherent in the Puerto Rican culture that will make you a gangbanger, but I do think that they are situations that we create as a society that push youth into joining gangs. For example, let's look at youth support systems here in Orlando and recognize that if you take Orlando and you compare it to other urban centers across the country, there are few services for youth in this city, an area that we need to grow in. If you start to look at the youth providing agencies here, you see that they're struggling a lot with budget. You know, a lot of youth services want to provide these services here to Orlando's population, but we don't have the financial support systems to help them grow. So I think that those type of factors will contribute more to an increase in gang behavior than whether or not a person is dealing with depression or whether or not a young person is dealing with suicidal thoughts.
So what are we lacking here that would make a difference?
I think we have to support our non-for-profit systems here. There's a lot of nonprofit centers here that are trying to grow with youth services and appear to be struggling financially. We have to prioritize our budgets, and we have to realize that if we do not take care of our youth, if we do not take care of our homeless, if we do not take care of our marginalized populations, what that is going to do is to create bigger problems in our city. If Orlando does not support the homeless population and create centers to help house the homeless and to help educate them, then we're just going to automatically have more homeless in the streets, which is going to automatically contribute to other social problems. And the same way, if we do not support our youth providing institutions, our youth service providing institutions, and don't allow ways for them to grow, then we're going to see more problems with our youth because they have nowhere to go. So they'll hang out in the streets, they'll hang out in the malls, and end up getting into trouble more.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break. Okay. We're going to be right back with Professor Estelli Ramos, and we are talking about the Latino population, specifically the Latino population here in Central Florida. we're back with Professor Estelli Ramos from UCF, and we are talking about Central Florida's Latino population and some of the challenges being faced by Latinos, not only here, but across the country. And one of the things that you and I had talked about earlier that I definitely want to touch on are the contributions that are being made by some of our immigrant populations. I have seen personally that Americans sometimes have trouble separating one Latino population from another, and they have a tendency to view them all as poor migrant workers who are sapping our public resources dry, and that's not the case. Absolutely. I read a story once that said that the Cuban population in Miami is the most highly educated immigrant population ever to come to this country. You mentioned about how our Puerto Rican population here in Central Florida tends to be a rather stable middle-class population. So let's talk about some of those contributions that are being made.
It's an excellent point that you're making. I think there's a tendency to stereotype Latinos in this country. You mentioned the Cuban population, and it's really interesting because there's different waves of Cubans in this country. The first wave of Cubans that arrived in the 60s were Cubans who were mainly professional and upper middle class, for political reasons left Cuba and moved to the United States, creating the Cuban community in Miami. And then we have two other waves of Cubans that have come since then. And it's really interesting to see how the Cuban population has immigrated or migrated to this country and has been able to adjust. You see the same thing with Mexicanos, that there's a tendency to stereotype Mexicanos as undocumented, illegal, troublemakers, gangbangers, whatever. The truth of the matter is that most Mexicanos are good, productive members of our society that want the best for their children also. I think a lot of times it's fears and stereotypes that create this. If we can demonize these undocumented persons, then more people in this country won't want them, and we can deport them or push them away. So there's that type of perspective that really influences how people view these various populations. But the truth of the matter is that there are many Latinos who care for their community, who love this country, who want to be a part of this country, who try to learn English in spite of the stereotype that they do not want to learn English. Yes, it's true, there are pockets in Miami where if you don't know Spanish, you won't be able to communicate.
You won't get through town.
And you're seeing that here in Orlando too. You're seeing entire populations of the Latino community here in Orlando where, everyone is speaking Spanish. As a Latino born and raised in the United States, for me, Spanish is more than just a language, it's a form of identity. So the attempt to hold on to it is important. And many Americans, or let's say white Americans, misinterpret that and look at that as being anti-American. But the truth is that Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Mexicanos are huge supporters of this country. Many of our youth are the first ones to sign up for the military. Many of our members are vibrant members in communities that want to support this country and be a part of this country. And there's also a growing middle class among Latinos. More and more Latinos are going to college as like any other group that has migrated to this country. As the second generation stays and learns the language, then the second generation is able to infiltrate more into the system and is able to enter into educational structures and able to go to the university. Here at UCF, we're seeing a huge increase, over 5,000 Latinos here in this great institution. So we're seeing this all over the country. So I think it's important for us to be able to differentiate between the different experiences and the different levels of immigration that are taking place here in this country.
We definitely struggle, we being Americans, we definitely struggle with the our way is the right way outlook on things. My mother right now has been working with an outreach group in Apopka. They work with immigrant workers, the migrant workers that are in the Apopka area. And she's a Latina, she grew up with what she thought was an understanding of the culture, and she herself has learned so much with this outreach group in Apopka. One of the things that struck her the most was the strength and the importance that is placed on family, that is the #1 priority for these groups that she's working with, beyond getting to college, beyond earning money, what is most important is building that family core and keeping that family core. And that was new information for her, and I was really amazed to consider how complex our Latino population is and how little we really do know about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the value structure is different. Here in the United States of America, we tend to be, we have certain values that will be different from the values of Latin America. For example, individualism is very important as an American. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Become your own independent individual self. Look out for yourself. Get your education, get your home, live in a suburb, create this living environment that's protected for you, your wife, and your children. Well, in the Latino culture, cooperative effort is a more important value, and individualism is really looked down at. And so in Latin American countries, the whole sense of community and familia become important. Me as a Puerto Rican living in Orlando, I have my home, but if one of my family members are in need, it becomes important for me as a Puerto Rican to open up my home, because familia or family becomes important. So the value base is different. And so that's some of the differences that we see when Latinos come here. Latinos are also very community oriented. They're very community centered. They will, as you start to see Latinos moving into these different various home associations here in Orlando, what you start to notice is, first of all, Latinos tend to use the front of their home a lot more. Latinos would tend to have more social gatherings. And if you have a nice home, you want to have your family and friends over, and your neighbors want to come over. And so the whole sense of community becomes important. So I think those are some of the conflicting values that we tend to see.
Another one of the things that we were talking about earlier are the different Latino populations that are coming into Central Florida. We have Puerto Ricans, we have Mexicans, we're seeing a lot of Colombians, Venezuelans, people from South America. You mentioned that you feel that probably people from the Dominican are not recognized, that they're here in greater numbers than we realize. What does that do for our community? What does that mean for us?
I think it calls for us to really define ourselves as a Latino community. There's a sociologist, Dr. Padilla, who wrote this incredible book in the 80s that was called Latino Consciousness. And it's really interesting as you look at his concept. And he basically said that the sense of having Latino consciousness is going to develop as various forms of Latino culture comes together and blends itself in expression, basically in second and third generation Latinos. It's a form of definition. Latinos who define themselves begin to form the sense of consciousness of understanding. We're not exactly a race, but we operate like a race. We have our own sense of identity, our own sense of definition. The Dominicans in this country play a big role in that. I was sharing with you earlier, I'm amazed of how there are well over 1.5 million Dominicans in this country. They are a population that's never talked about, and yet are huge contributors to Latino consciousness and to the Latino culture, not only through the music, through merengue and bachata, but also through its cultural expression. When you go to New York City, here in Orlando, the Dominican population is a very hardworking population. They tend to own a lot of businesses, hair salons, stores, restaurants. They're beautiful people who are just like every other Latino group here, but you don't hear a lot about them. It's been a question to me, especially, I originally come from Chicago that did not have a large Dominican population. I'm living here in Orlando. I see a huge Dominican population. I see no one talking about them. It's a research interest to me that I hope to look at in the future to help them define themselves and also contribute to the definition of what Latino means in this country.
But when we talk about these different populations, and when we go back to the discussion about gang activity, you said we are seeing gang activity in Central Florida, and it is of concern to you, but you're also thinking that we're kind of right on the cusp where maybe we can abate that successfully. Tell me about that.
That is definitely a huge interest for me. I come from Chicago, as I told you earlier, where I worked a lot with youth. I was raised in a community called Humboldt Park, which is the Puerto Rican community in Chicago. that was infiltrated and infested with gang problems. The Latin Kings and the Latin Disciples, Imperial Gangsters, those are all names we're seeing here. Also with youth forming gangs in Central Florida. What I find interesting, being a young man, used to be a young man, that was raised in the Latino community that dealt with street gangs a lot, and then going into the university and empowering myself and educating myself, and then going back to work in my community, I was always amazed with how many youth we lost to street gangs. I would say, I can remember in Chicago very clearly that there was a young man who was highly gifted and talented and was extremely brilliant, but because of street gangs had thrown all that away. And I couldn't help but imagine how this young man could have become a lawyer or a doctor because he had the ability to do so. But we lost him because of street gangs. Here in Orlando, in East Orlando, in the Latino community, we are seeing street gang problems. But it's not there yet. Gangs are just starting to grow. Well, my whole concern is, or my whole interest is, okay, how do we stop Chicago or New York from being created here? And we could do it. I really believe that as a social worker and as an educator. I really believe that we can stop the gang problem from growing here if we provide the structure to help our youth decide things that are positive. I don't believe any young man, if there's a young man right now who's looking at this program and he's gangbanging, I can definitely tell him one thing. You did not wake up in the morning and say, let me see, what can I do? Can I be a doctor? Can I be a lawyer? Or can I be a gangbanger? I think I want to be a gangbanger. I don't think anyone decides to be a gangbanger. I think there are social factors that go into play that create situations in the individual where little by little they start making choices that lead them towards gangs. It may be as simple as this young Puerto Rican man who just got here from New York and he's 10 years old and is ADHD and mother cannot afford insurance and there is no type of support for his medication and mom can't afford to keep him on meds and mom's struggling and she's going all over the place trying to get help. And there's no meds for him. And so he's in school, he can't focus, he can't pay attention. So he begins to get in trouble in school. Well, after 3 years of that, next thing you know, he doesn't want to be in school because he had a learning disability, was ADHD, and we didn't have the proper systems to support him. Well, he starts cutting school, he hangs out in the street. Who's there to welcome him? The street gang. So that's what I mean by prevention.
Okay, so it's a matter of the kids falling through the cracks.
Absolutely.
All right, well, I'm afraid we're out of time, which is unfortunate because I think there's a lot more that we can talk about. What we definitely wanted. Thank you for joining us. It was really interesting conversation. This is Professor Estelli Ramos, and he is a professor here at UCF. And that's going to do it for now. I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo. Thank you for watching Public Affairs Today.